You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
We're joined today by Edna Cowell Martin, author of Dark Tide, Growing Up with Ted Bundy. Edna, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Start by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I am a retired person now, which is exciting. I worked quite a bit into my, I just turned 70 a couple years ago, which is kind of what instigated all of this. And I live in the Seattle, Washington area, which is right in the heart of everything that was happening with Ted Bundy. And I am Ted's cousin, or I was his cousin, and this was a story that I had been keeping really literally to myself for the last 50 years. Felt like I couldn't keep it bottled up any longer. I needed to get it out. So that's what has brought me to the point of writing a book about it.
So map out the family connection, if you will, the moms and dads and cousins and all that stuff.
Louise Bundy is Ted's mom. My parents, all of them, grew up in the Philadelphia area. So my dad was the youngest of 7 kids, and his very oldest sibling was Samuel Cowell, who is the father of Louise. And he had 3 daughters. The oldest daughter was Louise. Sometime during 1946, she gave birth to a little boy, and it turns out that she was not married to this guy. They called them, unwed mothers, or, they had pejorative terms for them at that time.
Sure.
My parents had moved, before that, they had moved to, or not long before that, they had moved to the state of Washington to follow my mom's parents. My grandfather moved out and had a job with the Seattle Gas Company at the time. So my parents were already out here. And because of what she was going through, and Ted, she called him Teddy at the time, at age 4 was starting to sort of strike out, ask questions, and she was dealing with a lot of negativity about being a single mom. So my dad reached out to her and said, hey, you need to consider moving to the state of Washington. That's, 3,000 miles from there, and it gives you an opportunity to create a whole new narrative about your life. She subsequently changed her last name, took him up on it, and moved out to Washington. And at that point, my parents had moved down to Tacoma. From Seattle, that's about 35 miles. And my dad got a job at the University of Puget Sound at the time. He was a music professor. So my parents also had a 4-year-old son. So they opened up their doors to Louise and her 4-year-old son with 2 4-year-olds. I'm sure my mom, I can just imagine. She's this elegant lady. She grew up in a well-to-do household, and she had a nanny and other people, and now she's on her own, and she's got 2 crazy 4-year-old kids. But the interesting thing is that for up until I wrote this book, everybody thought that Louise Bundy and Ted Bundy came out and stayed with somebody called Alan and Jane Scott. And that was another author who had written a book, one of the first books about Ted Bundy, had used pseudonyms, and I'm forever grateful for her.
Wow.
To her for doing that, because that was one of the ways that we were able to stay out of the limelight. So that's the connection. So the only relatives that the Bundys, Louise and Ted, had in the state of Washington was us. That's how we became close.
And it sounds like, from reading the book, you almost sort of grew up with Ted kind of like a brother figure, along with your own brother. Would you characterize him like that, as almost brotherly towards you?
Well, he was like a big brother to me. He was 5 years older, as was my brother. And so actually, growing up, they hung out a lot together, and I became friends with his younger siblings. He was a great guy. He was always so nice and friendly. And we really enjoyed it when we had our family get-togethers. We had a cabin, in addition to our house, we had a cabin on Puget Sound. And so they would join us for picnics and events and things like that. And he loved to come out to the beach. And so we would spend a lot of time. We had 3 boats, so you could row a boat or take a little putt-putt boat, or if you were really gregarious. I've always been super into doing all kinds of things, so I was heavy into water skiing. So I was always happy if anybody wanted to do that. We saw a lot of them, and then we moved away because my dad got a job as a chairman of a music department at a university in the South. We left beautiful, cool Washington and moved to the heat of the South, and that was such a trip. Couldn't believe it. Humidity like I'd never seen before, and so many bugs.
Yes. So many bugs, too many bugs. I apologize on behalf of the South for all of our humidity and bugs. It's awful.
Oh gosh, it was an eye-opener. Thank goodness I had a great biology teacher in high school that made us go out and categorize them so I could learn what they were, and that took away my fear of them. But when I first got there, I was terrified. So it was crazy. So I didn't see Ted for a while we were living there, although he did come through and visit at one point.
A lot of people have talked about how charming Bundy was. And I've never met the man, obviously, but I sort of push back on some of that. But you actually knew Ted and were related to him. So is he as charming as people make him out to be?
He was very charming. He managed to put everybody at ease. He had a great smile and sparkling blue eyes. When he was around me and my friends, we were all impressed by him. I moved back to the Seattle area to finish up my junior and senior year at the University of Washington. I couldn't wait to come back. That's when I became really close to Ted. So we were much more on the same plane at that time. I was much more grown up as a college student. He was already out of undergraduate school at that time, but he still lived in the university district. So he lived in a rooming house just a few blocks from my apartment. And then he also had a girlfriend at the time that he would stay with. So he would alternate between those 2 places. And so we saw each other a lot. And when you ask about him being charming, he would come over and drop by my apartment. And that's when I saw him quite a lot, and we became really close as adults. And my roommates loved him. We all loved him. He was charming, and he would tell us all these great stories about all these things he was doing. And so we would sit around in awe of this guy, and he loved being the center of attention.
You know, you mentioned at various times in the book that you could see these traits in him, like that brilliant charisma, that need to be the center of attention, that he would later use to gain women's trust to their detriment, of course. Do you ever find yourself looking back on your interactions with Ted and second guessing them or even third guessing them?
Well, of course. You know, especially doing this project and all the research we had to do and finally facing up to my relationship with him, because I didn't want anybody to know I was related to a serial killer. I mean, who wants to be identified with somebody who murdered young women who were my contemporaries? You know, my heart going out to these families and just crying for them. All during this time, Ted is coming over and we're talking about these things, how scared we were. He's just agreeing that it's just an awful, awful thing. Yes, he could be so charming. And I do feel that, just as you described, he used that to his advantage because he was able to disarm people. You felt comfortable around him. He used this to approach young women.
I was saying, the English teacher in me was sitting here listening to those scenes, taking in those scenes and going, my God, the irony of him sitting there and putting on this performative show for you. Oh, yeah, it's certainly scary what's happening. My gosh, what kind of monster would do that? There were times when I sat there and read these scenes and I was just sitting there with my mouth open. My God, what a grand performance he was giving.
Yeah, and he enjoyed doing it, and he was good at it. He also would tell us these, you know, he told us about what he was doing, working for the re-election campaign for our governor, who was a very popular guy at the time, and going undercover into the opponent's camp wearing disguises So they wouldn't recognize him if he went back a second time. So doing all these things, you can't help but asking yourself, he is really perfecting this art of deception. And then he works for the Seattle Crime Commission. He's writing pamphlets on crime prevention for women. He writes a pamphlet on rape prevention for women. And we're so proud of him for doing this, because this is, you think about this in 1973 and 1974, this is when the women's movement was really taking hold, and we are all starting to feel really empowered and excited about what was going on. Billie Jean King was playing, that famous tennis match, and all this stuff was going on. And he's doing these things that seem positive for women. But why was he doing that?
In retrospect, do you think he was enjoying this sort of duality where he was pretending, at least, to be a good guy and helping women, while at the same time he's committing these heinous crimes?
I've talked to a lot of people who've worked with dual personalities like this. It's as if he had these two different masks. So when he's around family members and friends, he's one person. And obviously when he takes that mask off, God forbid who this other person was. I think that he probably amassed a lot of experience at working with people. I can't understand the anger and the rage and where that came from. I don't know if it's because he never found out who his biological father was, and that really, really, really bothered him. I don't know what it is that built up. He was angry at young women. He was rejected by this very classy young woman who came from a California, very high-level family. I think rejection of all these things, I have no idea, but I do believe, yes, Bill, that he definitely was building up to something.
You had mentioned in the book there was a time when you watched him slow dancing with your roommate and you saw the mask slip, and he had this just rage and hatred infused expression on his face. That must have been chilling.
Well, it was shocking because I'd never seen him like that before. And I kind of wondered if I could believe my eyes, Right. What was I seeing? Because we were dancing around. He'd come over with a bag of groceries, and so we cooked this wonderful dinner. And then afterwards, we were playing records and dancing around my apartment. I love to dance, so I'm always dancing. And I see him in my roommate in his arms, and they're slow dancing. And you got it right. He is looking down at her with this look on his face of, I didn't even recognize him, who he was, of complete rage, and his jaw is clenched, and he looks very angry. And the thing that really stood out to me at the time was his blue eyes were completely black.
Wow.
And I found out since then that this happens. Their irises dilate. So it completely removed all the blue. You know what I'm talking about? I mean, and that was happening. And I had to yell at him a couple of times to get his attention. And then it was as if he snapped out of a trance.
He didn't say or do anything to manifest that what you were seeing. He didn't hurt her or threaten her or you, but there was something about his expression.
It was his expression looking down at the top of her head, and it alarmed me. And I yelled. I had to yell a couple times at him. Finally, I turned off the music, and then I said, "Hey, Ted, are you okay?" And he finally kind of just, as if somebody just snapped out of something. And then just the whole mask was back in place. And then he smiled and said, "Oh, no, I'm just fine." But I'll have to tell you, he left just moments right after that. Mm-hmm. It was such a sudden departure that, the only speculation I have in retrospect, because at the time I was just confused. And then I kind of put it out of my mind going, oh, he must have had his mind on something else, or I mean, because why would you think otherwise? But then where did he go that night?
Oh, I had the exact same thought when you said that.
I mean, that's got to be the hardest part of this, I would imagine, is you're having to sort of reassess everything that you think you knew about this guy who really did seem to be kind, charismatic, the sort of perfect young man out there about to make his way in the world, out to go do successful things. What an absolutely horrible thing. And that's got to be very complicated. Does it make your memories of Ted more complicated, knowing, okay, I knew him as this wonderful person, but I also know that he was this horrible monster? That's got to be some weird cognitive dissonance right there.
So weird and so alarming because I'm hanging out with him and I don't have any idea. So you can imagine how much that makes me doubt my ability to judge somebody's character. That this person who was so vile and so violent was in my room and I completely trusted him and I exposed my girlfriends to him. And yet I did not know. And yes, that makes me really have very complex feelings about him. I'm angry with him for 50 years and felt deceived and manipulated and used and just horrified and just completely perplexed at how I couldn't know. How could I have missed the signs? How could somebody so successfully be two completely different people?
Tell us more about your discussions, what you can remember years later. You actually discussed some of the murders that were going on at that time with him in close to real time?
Yeah, actually. And my now husband, Don, who was my boyfriend at the time, had come up. He usually came up on weekends from Tacoma after work, usually a Friday. There had been these two young women abducted from a lake not far from Seattle, east of Seattle, called Lake Sammamish. Apparently, the person that did this was careless or bold or whatever because someone overheard him say his name was Ted. And someone also witnessed him walking towards a VW bug. And then, so what happened was and then two young women were kidnapped and disappeared. Nobody knew where they went. One earlier in the day and one a little bit later. So apparently he did these horrible things to one and then came back and got another one. We're just, we get the newspaper, I had two other female roommates and, we're all terrified. All these things have been happening almost one a month up to that point. Starting in the end of January, a young woman is attacked. She was one of the fortunate ones. She was left for dead, and that thing got interrupted. So she got lucky. I mean, not without lots of physical and mental repercussions for her. She lived, if you walked from Ted's apartment, he was 5 minutes from me, and he walked by my front door to my apartment building, crossed the street, and went around the corner. That's where she lived. So these things are happening once a month. So you can imagine how we're all getting more and more terrified. And we're afraid now to walk to class. It's on my bike. It takes me 10 minutes to get to campus. And I've never ridden a bicycle so fast. Or we'll team up with other people walking together. So fast forward to July. I've graduated. I'm living with my two roommates I've moved out of my apartment. I'm into a house. We're getting these papers and we see this composite drawing that an eyewitness had put together. And we're looking at it and we don't recognize who that is. Mm-hmm. But they say it's Ted and he has a tan V-dub or something like that. And I'm going, God, what a coincidence, because my cousin's name is Ted and he has a V-dub that looks a lot like what they're describing. And so Dawn is over at the house and the dog, Jeffy, starts barking. And we look out the front window and I see Ted's car parked out below. So Ted comes to the door and everything's fine at that point with the dog. No problems then. And he comes in. And so Dawn thinks, what I'm going to do is I'm going to thrust the picture of this composite into Ted's face and say something to him. So he does. He picks up the paper and he goes, oh, hey, Ted, this picture looks just like you. And we're thinking it looks nothing like him, but he was teasing him, not realizing that was Ted, the Ted. But Ted is so adept, he doesn't even hesitate a second. He goes, oh, God, I know. Isn't that awful? Isn't that terrible what's happened to all those girls? And then we're just feeling so badly for him. And then he says at that point, yeah, I've been interviewed by the police. And we feel terrible that he's been inconvenienced. And he says, yeah, there's V-dubs are everywhere. At this time, if any of you remember from that time period, it was a really, really popular car. There was something like 40,000 of them registered in the state of Washington.
Oh, my gosh.
A lot. There were a bunch of them with somebody whose name was Ted or Theodore or something like that. And he's telling us all this. And that's why he got pulled in, because his name is Ted and he has a V-dub. That's
he
what
was.
the police don't believe he's a suspect.
And do you think he was telling you the truth when he says he was interviewed?
I do. I absolutely do. And in my
Wow.
research, he was interviewed.
What a
So,
smooth operator.
smooth operator. He didn't even bat an eye. And here we were thrusting this right in his face at the time.
It really is just sort of astounding. The way that you wrote it, it's so compelling because you're going through this minute by minute, and we all know it's actually Ted. Ted is the one who's doing this, but we're getting all of these scenes of what it is like to watch you go through this minute by minute, not really seeing that your Ted is the Ted who's doing these terrible things. But I 100% can buy into it. I see it. I believe it. I can see how he would have absolutely pulled the wool over everybody's eyes because he was so smooth and charismatic and adept.
Exactly.
You know, there is this whole, still a cult of personality surrounding Ted, of women who are fascinated with him. What you're telling me, though, that does kind of jive with that. Like, I get why women are still really fascinated. I think it's abhorrent, but I get it. Like, how do you feel about this whole cult of personality around Ted?
You know, my only thought is there is something in these women's lives that makes them feel like they have to be attracted to somebody like this. So I feel sad for them in some regards, but I don't understand it. Mm-hmm. I can't identify with it. To me, it seems like an awful thing to do, is to somehow feel thrilled by a personality like that. And meanwhile, the thing that really gets to me, because the first thing my co-author and I, Megan Atkinson and I mean, we had long discussions because my first concern was about the families, the victims, that from his horrific acts to their daughters, their siblings, their cousins, their friends. And these families I would think are still suffering to this day. And some of them, their remains have never been found. And those families still haven't been able to put them to rest. And this is the thing that gets to me. And meanwhile, there are these people that are like this cult of personality where they have, I don't get it. I don't understand it. And I'm sure there's a lot of psychological reasons why they feel that way.
Bill and I have told the story on the podcast a couple of times, but we've never told it to Ted's cousin. I remember the very first time that we went to CrimeCon in Nashville. One of the very first people that I saw walking into a ballroom had a full face tattoo of Ted on her forearm. Oh. And it was like, I can't believe you would come to CrimeCon with a full face Bundy tattoo. And she wasn't the only one. It was... Gosh. It was incredibly, incredibly bizarre. And like I said, there is a certain amount of cognitive dissonance there. You know, women like our tattooed friend, she knows what Ted did. Why are you still walking around with him on your arm is sort of the question for me.
Yeah, I don't understand it. There's something in there that it would be interesting to find out what the attraction is. I have no idea.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. Before we get back to the podcast, just wanted to remind you that we have a GoFundMe effort going on right now. This campaign is designed to help us raise funds to help promote Mind Over Murder and specifically to push the Colonial Parkway Murders investigation forward. We'd love it if you could support us in any way that you can. Any donation from $5 to whatever you can afford is very much appreciated and will be incredibly helpful. The link is in the show notes and in our social media pages. As always, thanks for your support. Now back to Mind Over Murder.
You know, my first reaction is it's so disrespectful for the victims. But there's got to be more to it than that. This cult of personality. I mean, he was charming. He was good looking. When I finally came to realize that he was guilty of this, he was no longer charming or good looking to me. It was a tool that he used for evil. One of my mutual, acquaintances, and I didn't know her as well as my roommates did, was one of his very first victims. This is very personal. This is a really, really awful thing. This is nothing to glorify This is nothing to admire. There is not no kind of part of his personality that we want to emulate.
Well said.
Let's drill down on that. So who was this victim and what was her relationship to you?
Her name was Linda Ann Healy. She was the very first victim that we are aware of. Now, we think that he was way too practiced. This is according to Robert Keppel, the chief detective on his case.
Mm-hmm.
But I read his book, and I have to agree with him that he didn't think that Ted went from 0 to 100 miles an hour, just
Right.
like this young woman was best friends with one of my childhood friends who was also my roommate. And I had met her. I did not know her well, but she was a lovely person. And the effect that her disappearance had on one of my best buddies was absolutely terrible, because we all fretted horribly about what happened to Linda. But when you're a really good friend of someone who's disappeared, that you've confided in, you've shared your lives with, you've done things together, and then suddenly she disappears from the face of the earth. It was just an awful, awful thing. And she knew their family too, her family, Linda's family. And that good friend of mine, whose name I have not mentioned out of respect to her, and also the other roommate of mine they were roommates together at the University of Washington. She cannot even talk about it to this day. That's how upsetting it is still to her. So to have people that are idolizing him, disregarding the level of pain that he has caused is just, it's really hard for me to process that.
For me too, and this is something we've talked about before as the brother of a murder victim, still unsolved. I find this highly offensive. Now, Kristin knows I'm usually polite enough. I wouldn't go up and initiate a conversation. I would be polite, and I was polite, actually. I know that it's something I'm really, really uncomfortable with, and I think it is horrifically disrespectful. I actually publicly criticized CrimeCon in a lengthy article in the Washington Post for not taking steps to let people know how inappropriate that is when you've got, in addition to now 6,000 true crime fans meeting typically once a year, you also have a smaller group, but it's a couple of hundred people who are subject matter experts like ourselves and others who are speaking about true crime and unsolved cases and solved cases and survivors' stories like we've talked about Kathy Kleiner-Rubin, who survived Ted Bundy, and many, many others. So you've got a chunk of people attending CrimeCon that have direct connections, including often family members of murder victims, some of whom are looking for answers in their loved ones' cases, and they're all part of this mix of true crime community. CrimeCon took steps after that to really kind of shift the focus, and I will give them credit for this. They let people know that this isn't Comic-Con or some other place where we dress up as fantasy characters, and that there are family members of victims who are there and survivors who are there, and we need to be respectful of the fact that they're also attending these events. So as I've said through gritted teeth, you walking around with a picture with a serial killer's face on your T-shirt or whatever, it's not appropriate. And you might think that's hip and cool and edgy, but you know something? No, it's actually offensive and gross and disgusting.
Yes, I'm proud of you. Good for you for doing that.
To be fair, they did take steps at CrimeCon to let people know, and they've gotten a lot more victim-focused. I understand that there's going to be some graphic talk and maybe some difficult moments at a conference like this, but this is not a conference of law enforcement or forensics experts where those conferences can be very, very gritty. But that's, when you're talking about how to solve difficult cases, sometimes the conversations themselves are difficult. I share your perspective. I'm completely baffled by it. I'm actually offended, and Kristin knows I'm actually not easily offended. But this is one thing that just really sets me off. We can move on from there. I appreciate your perspective on this.
Wholeheartedly. I don't get it.
And I'm curious, do you consider you and your family to be secondary victims of Ted? How have you dealt with the trauma and the turmoil of this? You've had to live with it for the last 50 years. How in the world have you been able to sort this and, compartmentalize it and keep it from bleeding into all other areas of your life? That's got to be difficult.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are primary victims of Ted, and I didn't feel that I even should have anything to talk about because of what they went through. But I realize now over time, and that's part of the reason why I wrote this book, is that there are adjacent victims. There's, his siblings I know that they have suffered because of it. Many, many people who knew Ted and trusted him, so many people have become victims of it, because they stood up for him. And yes, I realize now that I am also a person who has, because even the mention of his name over the years, I would get like a jolt through me as if I'd stuck my finger in a light socket. Mm-hmm. That's how much his name upset me. I couldn't even stand to hear his name. And it came up everywhere. I was not a true crime fan. I never had been because of him, and avoided it because I didn't want to face up to it, to the horror of it. We hid out. We avoided whatever we could do to make sure that when the frenzy was taking place during the countdown to his execution, they were looking for everybody to interview. And we just prayed that they would not find us. It was an awful, awful time. First of all, because I still had these really dual feelings. I hated the monster side of him, and I mourned the part that I cared about so much, and the loss of potential, because he was on such a trajectory, going to law school and doing all these really great, what looked like great things. And yet this is the way he went. So that was a really difficult time, and we lived in fear that the press would find us, because we'd seen what they put his mother through, and oh my God, it was horrible. We didn't want to do that. So yes, I finally have come to realize that it's okay to admit that yes, there's lots of layers of victims, and we're one of those layers. Nothing compared to the primary ones, but we are a type of victim as well.
What I really enjoyed about Dark Tide, one of the many things I enjoyed, I should say, and I want to commend you for the fact that you were willing to include this. You included a lot of your prison correspondence with Ted. It was so fascinating to read because you can hear and see that struggle. I love the relationship that we used to have because you are my family, but also, oh my God, what have you done? You need to confess. And you can see that there was struggle in there. You could see the way that he pushed back on it every time. Oh, I don't worry about the past. I worry about the now. What BS. I have to commend you for being willing to put that in there, because some of that has got to be really hard to look at now.
It is. And yet I wanted people to see what he was like and what he was saying from prison, and how he was not facing up or coming to terms at all with his actions. And yet to such an extent that he was saying things like, the past is the past. You need to know me as I am now. And I was saying, well, you know what? You are a sum total of your past actions. You cannot say that your present self isn't a result of what you did in the past. Look at where you are, Ted. It's because of what you did. And I wanted him to come forth for the families. I wanted him to, if I could have any influence on him, I wanted him to tell why he had done it, and where some of the remains were of some of the young ladies, young women that he killed. And girls, young people too. But it was a fruitless endeavor. I was obviously very naive, but I had to try.
You were able to save some of the letters. Were you typing these, or were they handwritten?
Well, you see, back in I didn't have a computer. Mm-hmm. I did have a typewriter, but these were all handwritten. So that there's something about handwriting a letter, because it's not very fast. Mm-hmm. It gives you the opportunity to really put your thoughts together. And that's what I did. I handwrote them. And he did me a big favor in that he sent back 2 of the letters. Like, oh, you should be embarrassed about these. I'm going to send them back to you. And I'm so grateful that he did, because then it showed the, back and forth conversation that we had in those letters.
Were his responses handwritten as well?
Yes.
And did you have any awareness as to whether prison authorities were reading your letters in and his letters out?
I'm sure that somebody must have. I think he wrote his letters, but he couldn't seal them. And they came to me obviously sealed, but possibly somebody else looked at them first. I'm guessing that that's what happened, and I kind of have the impression that's what was happening then. So I'm sure somebody else wrote them. But you know what? I couldn't touch them with my hands. I had to put on gloves because I was so freaked out about, and I'm not a superstitious person at all, but I felt like just evil essences were emanating from those letters.
I get it.
I just wanted to put a barrier between him and me at that point.
You'd said in the book that you still have the letters, like you've kept them.
I kept them. I felt like, okay, so I majored in history, and I feel like these were historical documents.
Mm-hmm.
Vile as they are, they're part of history. And so I felt incumbent upon me to save them in a box in a dark part of the basement as far away from the family as possible. So I honestly had not opened up that box for decades until I started working on this project.
You mentioned something very interesting about your work on Dark Tide, the book. You said that you started watching documentaries about Ted Bundy in order to kind of, I would say, familiarize yourself with the facts. What was it like for you to watch those docs?
I could only watch them in the morning, not at night. So I'm an early riser, but I felt that it was important that I do my research and do my due diligence. And so I cherry picked which books to read, and I had very specific authors who, like Robert Keppel, the detective, the guy that was a political reporter who became a friend of mine, that I actually have a chapter about him. I read his book, and then the woman that worked beside him on the suicide hotline.
Anne Rule.
Right.
Book. In fact, I asked him about Anne Rule in one of the letters, and that was a pretty funny response he gave me.
He kind of discounted it. He made it sound like she was just sort of making stuff up. I was like, really?
Yes, a half-truths. And my husband thinks that's one of the funniest lines. He goes, so it was half right? I mean,
yeah.
Yeah. He sounded kind of grandiose about the whole entire thing. Like, he was disapproving of all of this, the wrong kind of publicity.
Right. But he also, in my mind, had to love that publicity too. But
sure.
The narcissist in him had to love it. And then at the same time, criticize anything he thought, any writer didn't get correct.
That exactly describes him. I mean, he is the epitome, the epitome of a narcissist, the absolute worst kind. Yes, he loved the attention. Yeah, so I get up early to watch those, some of the more well-known, well-done versions, and they were very helpful too. Just to kind of get an idea of what was going on at the time, and we were reading everything. And Megan's amazing too as a co-author. She's a talented writer too, and she's also as attuned to getting the facts right as I am. We're both researchers, and we didn't want to even start writing until we had done a month or two of research to make sure we weren't messing up on timelines and what happened during the time, what was happening historically at that time, because so much was happening.
There has been so much about Ted. I mean, everything from the Ted Bundy tapes on Netflix to Liz Kendall's book came out, The Phantom Prince. There has been so much done about Ted. I'm not necessarily saying that you should call out the bad actors, but were there any that you watched or read that you were like, oh my gosh, what? No, they got it wrong, or this is nonsense? Were there any that you were just like, nope?
Yeah, I mean, I would see some things even in some of their books. Most of it was amazing what those particular people had written. All of them, did a good job. And my heart goes out to Liz. I mean, can you imagine having this person as your boyfriend and not having a clue for quite a while, and then starting to suspect things? I mean, oh my gosh. And exposing her little girl to him. There's so much written about him, and some of it is just crazy some of them glorify him in ways that we've already discussed. So yeah, I don't even want to give them the time of day.
Were there mistakes ever about like Ted or your family that you found? Like, as a historian, I know that you're probably looking and kind of double checking. Was there ever any egregious, glaring errors that you found that made you go, hey, I think this person needs to be put right?
I mean, there was a lot of speculation and
Okay.
things like that. You see a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists writing things. A lot of their take was pretty interesting. You'd see a lot of people who claimed that they were approached by Ted. And I'm not saying that they weren't. He probably approached a lot of people before he found someone who would, actually allow him to draw them away. But there's a lot of that. Some of them couldn't have happened because he wasn't even in the area at that time. But my heart goes out to those people because something happened that still scared them. Until I wrote this book, everybody thought, I think I may have already mentioned this, that when Louise and Ted came to stay with our family, they thought that they were staying. It was everybody up in Wikipedia and everything said they stayed with Jane and Ellen Scott. That was actually my parents.
Mm-hmm.
So little things like that. Sure, there's some big stuff and there were some little things.
Is this the sort of thing, we know how much work has gone into co-writing this book. Would you ever want to write about Bundy again, or do you feel like you've gotten out of your system what you needed to get out?
No, you notice there's no image of him on the cover of my book.
Yes.
Yes.
I did not want to give him that power of being on the cover of my book. No way. No, not at all. And I wanted to exorcise him out of my system.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote this book to get him out of there, and he no longer has any power over me. And it was the best thing the writing the book was great. I felt like I released a lot of things, and he didn't get a chance to say otherwise. So I'm done with him.
So the word catharsis comes to mind.
Oh my gosh.
That's a good word.
Even the last image that you had of that dream that you have of Ted searching for his grave, I was like, what? If that isn't your subconscious sending a whole bunch of stuff up from the vault, there it is.
That was so weird, because how often do you remember a dream when you wake up?
Mm-hmm.
I rarely do. And Megan and I were in the midst of writing this, and we would write back and forth. I would write and send her things, and then she's such a beautiful writer. She would send it back, and oh my gosh, but anyway, I woke up one morning and I had this dream about looking for stones with Ted and my brother, and we were back on our beach on Falusi Bay and in the Puget Sound. I just ran into my office and I just quickly wrote it down because I thought, God, this is so amazing. And I wanted to put him to rest. I wanted to end it with him, put him in the grave, and that's it. That must have been my subconscious talking, because that's what happened.
And why do you think that the fascination with Ted persists so many decades after his crimes? Because I have students who are like, oh, Ted Bundy. I know about Ted Bundy. They don't know about other serial killers, maybe necessarily, but like right now, it's they know Bundy, they know Dahmer, they know Gacy. Ted is right up there. Why do you think this fascination just persists years upon years upon years later?
Yeah, and you guys are clear across the country, not necessarily in one of the states where he caused all his reign of terror. He was one of the first. I think that he kind of epitomizes what a serial killer is. And that was the original big book that was written about him, Ann Rule's book, that turned into a movie with a very attractive actor playing the role of Ted, Mark Harmon.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that was, and also he was good looking and handsome. And so he didn't fit into the mold of what people thought of as an evil looking person. Which, I've asked a lot of young women since then, what is their fascination with true crime? And it's all over the board. And a lot of them have heartfelt tones in their voice have said because they want to know what to look out for.
Which is valid.
Mm-hmm.
What's that? Yeah. So I think that, there is a fascination because also with the fact that we didn't know, and this person was right in the literally the bosom of our family, and we did not know it. And I think that really gives people chills. It still gives me chills to even say this, that someone can be so successful at wearing a mask that they completely fool the people around them who think they know them. So what has that done to me? It's changed how I look at people. When I meet someone, I honestly, and I was in sales for 40 years, and I was really successful at it because I go, I wonder what's behind that mask.
Mm-hmm.
And I would ask many, many open-ended questions to get a lot of information from them. And also, I want young women to know and to be alert. I want them to be freaked out all the time, but just don't willy-nilly walk off with somebody, obviously. Yeah. But I'm an avid walker, and I spend a lot of time walking by myself. And I have, on many occasions, come up behind a young woman who is wearing earbuds.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And she has no idea that I'm walking up right behind her.
Yeah.
And she has effectively blocked out one of her primary senses. And if you need to have situational awareness all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You never know what's going on. And when I'm out walking, I will turn around and check behind me on occasion and, around on the sides of me, but I keep on going. It doesn't keep me from doing it, but I can't help but telling these people, I have to tell you a story. And, and then that kind of blows their mind. They go, okay. Sometimes they're very annoyed with me, but I don't care. I hope that they remember, that this is not a safe thing to do.
Honestly, that's something my own students need to hear. Absolutely, because they do not have that kind of situational awareness, and most of them do walk around with AirPods in all day long. So,
they're so absorbed with their phones that they have no idea what's going on around them. And believe me, there's a lot of stuff going on around them.
Well, the book is Dark Tide: Growing Up with Ted Bundy by Edna Cowell Martin and Megan Atkinson. Edna, this has been delightful. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was very interesting. I really appreciate it.
That is going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time. Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder. Thank you.